Well, welcome everyone to the Everyday Humanitarians Conference. I'm very pleased to be introducing our first guest, one of my favorite people in the world. His picture's up here on the wall. You can't make out his picture, but it's over here on the wall next to me. Brian Johnson. He's a philosopher, CEO of theos, the founder of some incredible companies we're going to be talking about today, and an incredible friend, a great guy. Brian, it's such a pleasure to be sitting down with you today.
Travis, I'm thrilled to be here. Love everything you're doing, and excited about our chat.
Thanks. Well, I wanted to brag on you just for a second and explain to everybody why I'm so thrilled that you're here. I first came across you when you were doing Zots a long time ago, and came across your blog. You recommended going to a meditation retreat, which I did and was incredible for me before Peace Corps. I've been following you ever since. You were kind enough to send Philosopher's notes to us in Mongolia. We read all of those, and I've still been reading them. I have your book right here, A Philosopher's Notes. Then been following along with theos as long as it's been around. It's just been such a pleasure to follow along with you, to learn from you. You're such an incredible guy. I feel lucky to be able to ask you some questions about your journey today. And I just wanted to say thanks again. I mean, you're such an incredible person to know, and I feel really honored to be able to sit down with you.
Well, I appreciate it, and I've always appreciated your energy over the last, I don't even know how long it's been now, but I remember sending that package to you in Mongolia and just really appreciated you and who you were and how you were showing up, and the amazing letter that we got back in return, and just thrilled to be able to do more with you, with theos and everything else we're doing. So thank you. The admiration is mutual.
Thanks. Well, I'd like to start in the documentary Finding Joe, which I hope everybody goes out and sees. It's an incredible movie. You talk about your story, and you start with when you were at Arthur Anderson, and after you had been going to law school for a little bit, you were thinking about your life, and you said in a 24-hour period, you went through something you called the skin shedding, like a snake, and you talked about what that was like and making all these big decisions, and you decided to follow your bliss. And that was something in the movie you're talking about with Joseph Campbell. But can you walk that through us? Can you walk us through that a little bit? What was that like to make that huge transition and tell a little bit of that story that you tell in the movie?
Yeah, the word that comes up is uncomfortable. So if we rewind, how long ago was that now? I'm just turned 40. So that was right after graduating from university at UCLA. Started my career at Arthur Anderson at 22. I came from a blue-collar family, first-generation college student, and really had no idea what I wanted to do. Got swept up into the Arthur Anderson kind of group, and was blessed to do a lot in a year. Worked in 4 different service lines, but the first week that I was driving home from work, I literally threw up. I had to pull over on the side of the 405, and anyone who's been to LA knows the 405. Traffic is going by, it's 5:30 or 6 or whatever it is. I'm on the side of the freeway throwing up into like a sweater or sweatshirt or something I had in the passenger seat. And just a visceral feeling of that wasn't what I was here to do. And I hadn't done any of the work that I've now done. So I had no idea of what purpose was or dharma, or even the idea that I could create something that I really wanted to create beyond a very inkling of an idea. And then showed up, went to work, did that, and then law school is my kind of escape valve to, okay, well, I'll go to a good law school, and that'll give me a stamp that, I can now go out and succeed in the world. But frankly, I knew before I even went to law school, that wasn't it. And what's funny, I've thrown up twice in significant moments like that. I threw up the day I moved into law school. So I'm moving into my apartment after driving up there, and I just knew that wasn't it. I didn't even make it a full semester. And I dropped out of law school. I had no idea what I wanted to do. I ended a relationship of 5 years in the same 24-hour period. And it was incredibly tough. I had none of the practices I engage in now. Was literally spinning emotionally and psychologically, and just had no idea of how I was going to give my gifts to the world. And it was deeply painful. So, a lot of times, and then we can talk about what I did, and it looks like it was all awesome and fun, but it came out of a lot of despair and a lot of fear and a lot of, despair is a good word, of just not being clear on how I was going to show up in the world, because we're so conditioned to do certain things. And I was clear, I can't do that. Like, that's not what I'm here to do. Yet I had no clue where I was going to go or how I was going to cultivate myself, other than I had one little tiny idea, which was I wanted to coach a Little League baseball team. It was the only thing that I kind of that inspired me at that point, reading and coaching a Little League baseball team. And I did that. And long story a little shorter, wound up coming up with an idea to help these teams and leagues involved in sports get on the internet. This is 1998, and no one was doing anything for them. And I saw that in 5 years, every team and league in the world would be online using schedules and standings and pictures and stuff like that. So we created a business on very little money, like less than $10,000, my partner and I. And we won the business plan competition at UCLA's Anderson School of Business. We raised $1 million, another $4 million. And the funny part of that story is we wound up hiring the law firm that I would have wanted to work for before I would have graduated from law school. So that was kind of the, the bit of vindication, if you will. But couldn't have predicted that. Literally, no way. But I followed what little inkling of bliss I had at that time of my life. Again, with no conception of where it would lead, just that was what I needed to do. And then, some pretty magical things transpired out of that.
Yeah. Well, actually, I wanted to ask you a little bit about that, about jumping into e-teams. And I'd love to talk a little bit about how you can keep your mind open to thinking forward that far into the future and realizing this is going to happen. I think we can be part of that. We can create something that will be part of that. But now everybody looks back and goes, oh, yeah, of course that was going to happen. Mm-hmm. But can you talk a little bit about what were some of the big favorite things that you learned from that experience creating the e-teams?
Yeah, well, what's funny is that I was 24 years old when I, had the idea and we started creating it. And I talked to a couple of people who, were pretty significant and knew some different things. One was a father of a friend of mine, and they literally told me it was impossible. I said I wanted 1 million teams using our system in 5 years. And at the time, there were literally just dozens of them on Yahoo was the big directory at that time. And one guy told me, take another hit on that pipe, literally, quote, unquote. Good luck with that. You have no business experience, you have no money, you have no contacts, and there's not even a need, is what he said. There's no market need. That's rule number one. You got to have a market need. And for whatever reason, actually, I know the reason. A, I knew we could do it. And B, I refused to go and do the alternative. I couldn't go back and get a normal job. That was worse than anything. So I think that early lesson in really believing in what's possible and then fiercely committing to that and not compromising and saying, I'll do whatever it takes for however long it takes. I didn't have that phrase at the time, but in hindsight, I had that attitude. And then we just rubbed nickels together and ate a heck of a lot of canned tuna and pot pies, and Taco Bell was a feast, back in the day. It went from there.
Wow. Well, then after e-teams, your second business was Zods. And maybe actually you didn't mention here the CEO that you hired in for e-teams, but what was that like moving to a position where you knew you needed to bring in other people? It started growing so rapidly. It was becoming so successful. You brought in more leaders to the organization, and eventually you sold it and moved on to a second business. But before I jump into that, I was wondering if you could share a little bit about what was it like once it was obvious that it was succeeding and you brought in all these other people. What was it like then to transition away from it and decide, well, I'm going to try something new?
Yeah, well, again, in retrospect, it looks like it was a straight line up. Once I got through the challenging times and it was just straight up, but it was anything but that. I mean, it was very much, as Campbell would say, kind of that hero's journey of constantly fighting the dragons and ton of self-doubt and a ton of, is this really a good idea? Is this really going to work? We had no money. We had no resources. We weren't, there was just a lot of that we moved through. And even when we had raised $1 million and $4 million, that doesn't go away. That actually gets heightened. It did for me as a 24, 25-year-old entrepreneur with no meditation practice, no consistent exercise, no conditioning of my mind, et cetera. So it wasn't without challenge the whole time. Having said that, we got clear. We raised $5 million, and I was 25 years old, and we brought in a firm to help us find a CEO. We hired the CEO of Adidas to replace me as a CEO, which was awesome, right when the market crashed in 2000. So we went from spending $10,000 total in the first year to $500,000 a month, and the market just literally, the bottom went out. And so it was a challenging time. again, like just gnarly, actually. We had 45 employees and needed to trim back to 30, then to 15, and unpleasant. And again, just learned a ton. But he was great to work with, an extraordinary mentor, and we wound up selling it to a company that had raised 10 times what we raised, and it now serves 3 million teams. So, you know, in the big picture on the resume, it's 3 lines and it looks great, you know. But really, what I've learned in the last 15, 20 years is it's all a process. And how do you get a little bit better day in and day out, approach it with a growth mindset, and then honor the practices that keep you plugged in so you can serve most profoundly. And then know that anytime you're truly challenging yourself and you're really going out to your edge, by definition, that's scary. And that's I used to make myself wrong. Like something was wrong with me that I had fear, generally speaking, or specifically before a call or before a meeting or whatever it was. And I've learned since then that that's actually a great sign. That's a sign that I'm willing to grow and I'm pushing my edges, and I need to reorient and lean into that rather than think something's wrong with me. So I just like to make sure that the myth or the story doesn't become a myth that's sugar-coated as if it was all easy, because it wasn't. And then as I've built my practices, you know, over the last 15 years, it's become easier because I now have skills and tools. Yet it's, of course, still has challenges and all that good stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That reminds me, actually, you've started, I think, in your businesses, it seems pretty clear that you've spent a lot more time on yourself as time has gone on. That in Zods, the idea behind the business is very spiritual and reflective. Then with Philosopher's Notes, and then again within Theos, I feel like that's a trend. You're becoming increasingly reflective, thinking about yourself, making sure that you're doing the best you can to be living through your hero's journey. But in your second business, what brought you to Zods? What brought you to the idea of Zods as your second endeavor?
Yeah, so after I sold eTeams, I spent a few years just reading and writing and thinking, and then started Zods, which was really kind of a combination of, it was basically MySpace at the time was big for people who want to make a difference in the world. And so it was a combination of my background in social media and social networks before they were called that, and my passion for helping people optimize their lives. And yeah, so it's been a growing arc and just a real integration between those two things of how do I personally optimize my life, connect to the highest within myself, and then create a business that helps people do that. And that's essentially what, you know, in hindsight, the last 15 years have been for me. It's kind of that integration. And as you said, in Theos is kind of the next step on that for me. And, you know, we're having a lot of fun with that.
So then, creating Zods, you decided actually, after creating Zods, to give yourself a PhD in optimal living. And that involved creating Philosopher's Notes, which is something that I enjoyed tremendously. Can you talk about what that was like? How did you decide to give yourself a PhD in optimal living?
Yeah, well, I decided to sell Zods when it realized that wasn't quite what I was here to do, and we sold that, and then didn't know exactly what I wanted to do, but then quickly realized I'm going to give myself a PhD in optimal living, as you said. And there wasn't a program that integrated what I wanted to study. I looked at positive psychology, classic philosophy, business, but nothing integrated everything I wanted to study. So I decided to give it to myself. And the Philosopher's Notes was the master's project, basically, in that. And yeah, the intention was, let me really deeply study and integrate these truths, and also create a business that demonstrated that you can get paid to do what you love to do in service to the world. So that was a big part of it, which is where the Philosopher's Notes came from. And that wound up being kind of the root of what is now in Theos. So, but again, I didn't have clarity of exactly what all the steps would look like. I just knew that it was time to make the leap. And I think that's an important thing. It's been an important thing for me in my process of just being willing to take the next step, not seeing the entire journey, but knowing that where I was headed wasn't quite the right direction. And as I've done it again and again and again and again, not always with an outcome that's worth talking about. There are many dead ends of, no, that wasn't as good of an idea as I thought, but I learned something that I could bring back into the next idea. But that willingness to fail, the willingness to step out, I mean, that's the definition of a hero's journey, is it's the forest of the unknown. And Campbell says if there's a path, that's the one certain sign that it's not your path. you've got to be willing to go where no one's gone before. And that's by definition scary. It's much easier to go down a trodden path, on one sense, although ultimately for those of us who are into this conversation, it's not ultimately possible,
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think one special thing about Philosopher's Notes is you had this opportunity to read. I don't know if anybody, I mean, sometimes people go their entire lives and don't read as many of the kind of books as you were reading in this 1 year period. But you read all these incredible books. You were able to summarize them and share them with others and surround yourself. Something that you talk about often is your spiritual family tree, and you surround yourself with all these great people. So, then I get the benefit of being able to read something like this, which is a summary of so much of what you read. But then also, I imagine one way you can't predict everything is some of these things happen through conversation. You had a conversation with Stephen Pressfield after the Philosopher's Notes, and he talked to you about something that ended up turning into the next step. Can you talk about what that was like? How did you decide to go from Philosopher's Notes to now this really big undertaking of helping so many people through in theos?
Yeah, great question. So my wife and I, Alexandra, started in theos over 4 years ago when we got married. And we kind of started playing around different things. And then it was a breakfast with Stephen Pressfield, where he asked me, we were talking about classic Greek virtue. He's written on that extensively, and we were just connecting on that. And he said, have you ever considered creating a modern day Plato's Academy? And I just thought that was the coolest question, the coolest idea. And it was one of those, I jokingly say, choir of angels moments, which I've had a few times. It was just, that's a really good idea. What would that look like? Like, what would a modern day Plato's Academy look like? And for me, it became highly practical, obviously virtual, and it would be the world's greatest teachers on every aspect of how to optimize our lives. So we started that, I think it was 3 years ago now, almost exactly 3 years ago. And we produced 100 classes, and it was awesome. You were involved with that in multiple ways. And yet it wasn't quite it. It worked. We actually did rather well. But when I looked at the business closer, it wasn't strong enough for me to really kind of lean into it. So we stopped it completely. And then we focused on our virtual conferences and other stuff. And we just relaunched it 6 months ago with a different model. And again, what I've learned creatively and entrepreneurially is the willingness to experiment and to test a ton of things. And then to be honest about what's working and what's not. And then to trust yourself of, okay, let's move in this direction. And again, be willing to evolve and have that growth mindset. But that was amazing synchronicity. Almost didn't make it to the meeting. Our car, had issues that morning. It was bizarre. Our little Prius we had left on, but a friend loaned me his car and got there just in time. And just, one of those surreal things. If you don't know what's going to be the trigger, but just be in the game, follow your heart, and do good work, and good things tend to happen over the long run.
Yeah. Well, and I think you've gathered so many great people. I know that people that taught in the first academy are also teaching in this version and have created virtual conferences. Some people have been involved in so many different aspects of the business, but it seems like you've built this incredible community. And actually, part of the Entheos community now is the Oasis community. Can you talk about how that process of moving from classes to now having more of a community build to Entheos, what was that process like developing the company?
Yeah, well, we're very purpose-driven, as you know. So we're all about helping people optimize their lives so we can change the world together. And we had entertained doing a nonprofit when we started it and realized, no, we want to create a for-profit that embodies these ideals of conscious capitalism and that demonstrates how powerful a force for good business can be. And so the challenge with that is, okay, how do you create something cool that truly helps people optimize their lives that's a highly impactful, highly profitable, sustainable business? And so we've experimented with a ton of things. We do the virtual conferences, we do the academy, which we just talked about briefly, and we do the social side of things. We call it the Oasis. And that's really my entrepreneurial background. And I like to say kind of my 10,000 hours is in that, of building a place where people can connect with one another. And the shorthand is Facebook for optimal living. So imagine a social site that's all about this conversation. It's all about connecting with people who share your passion for making a difference in the world, totally positive, grounded, not out of control, but really positive, beautiful people that are committed to living a life of integrity and virtue and meaning and making a difference in the world. And I'm so excited about that. And that's the basic idea with the Oasis. And again, just giddy about that in the years ahead.
Yeah, well, and I've loved it too. It's an amazing community to be part of, and I'm telling all my friends about it. And everyone has, and people have been going back on Facebook and saying, "Hey, I know, some of my friends, like they'll say, "Hey, I know you've been thinking about leaving Facebook. You should look at this. This is a really great community." And I think that's going to be really exciting, that people are going to really find an oasis in this new community. That people are positive, they're really supportive. It's just a really great thing to be part of. I know that you have been sharing comments with people every day, and people are very transparent about the challenges in their life, but also the things they're excited about. It's very unique. I really have never seen anything like it before.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and we're excited, and it's just great human beings. I mean, it's deeply inspiring for me, and yeah, that's, as we discussed the other day. I mean, that's one of the things I'm most excited about, is really serving that community and creating a true oasis where people can connect and inspire one another and make a difference.
Yeah. Well, I want to take one of the exercises from your book. Tal Ben-Shahar talks about the 110-year-old you. So you already know what this is, but I'll explain it to the viewers here. The idea is that there's a time machine that is created when you turn 110 years old. Your 110-year-old self is able to come back to this moment and talk to you for an hour or for 5 minutes and share wisdom with you, with yourself. So I was wondering if you could do that with us. What do you think the 110-year-old Brian would come back and say for 5 minutes to you right now?
It's a great question. Uh, the energy that I feel, I just turned 40 last week, and very catalyzing for me, and it's very exciting to kind of enter this new phase. So a lot of reflection on just what am I here to do, and now's the time to do it, basically. So as I really embody that and then look at it from the 110-year-old perspective, the energy that I feel is just a sense of deep grounded enthusiasm and just joy and a smile and a sense of none of it is a big deal. It's all a game. There's just an opportunity for us in this brief lifetime to fully express ourselves and to live in integrity with what we think is important, to do so with a level of really heroic courage in today's world. We're conditioned to think that certain things are important that just aren't. And how do we align with the deepest, highest within ourselves and playfully and joyfully, courageously and confidently live in integrity with that? And then just create cool stuff, serve profoundly, open our hearts, and just live with that radiant enthusiasm that I like to say you only get when you're living in integrity with your deepest values. But just a sense of lightness is what I feel from that vantage point. And I think I can tend to get perfectionistic and take things way more seriously than they need to be taken, and hold both, where yes, there's an opportunity and I would say an obligation to serve profoundly. And it's just not a big deal. And do it and just go for it. Be willing to make those mistakes and celebrate the whole process, and set those big, audacious goals. Go for them with a light spirit and just a committed sense of integrity. And that's a meandering discourse from a certain part of me,
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I feel like a lot of that reminds me of meditation, though, too. This idea of the fundamentals of meditation can help ground you in that way, where you come away from it excited, but not necessarily connecting to your ego, not necessarily connecting to, I've got to do this right now. I think it kind of grounds you. And you mentioned that in the very beginning of the interview. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your fundamentals. What does that mean? I know they've been very important to you, and people can go on the Oasis to see exactly what they are, which is fantastic. But can you talk about what they are and why they're so important to you?
I think I just had a conversation with a woman who's starting a business and really passionate and going through the heroic challenges that one has when they're following their dreams. And whenever I have those conversations, I never talk about the specific mechanics of anyone's given strategy. We all have unique challenges. Well, how do I do this project? Or how do I do that? And I don't know. I mean, of course I can give ideas and you can give ideas and whatever, and that's fine. But ultimately, we need to make those decisions on our own, and we can get good counsel, but we need to trust ourselves. But what I do know is that the most important part of any creative endeavor in any form is the individual, and then, of course, the individuals, but the individual who's part of it. And so for me, the fundamentals are literally the most important thing I do every day. And they're the most important thing for my family. They're the most important thing for our business. And specifically what those are for me are meditation. It's the first thing I do every morning is meditate for 20 minutes. Not nuts, but 20 minutes every single day. And that's been an hour or two a day at times, and it's been as little as 15 minutes, but 20 minutes a day. I do a little yoga for 5 minutes. I do one sun salutation in an opening series, not a big deal, but I do it every single day. I read a philosopher's note. I journal. I check in on our Oasis, and I approve scholarships. We give away scholarships in our to everything we do. And that's the first thing I do. The last thing I do in my morning rituals before I check my email and get going on the business side of things. And it grounds me in this idea of profound service. But training our minds, exercising, and nutrition, and then rest and gratitude and these things. Those are my primary fundamentals. And I would offer they're everyone's primary fundamentals. And I like to challenge people to identify what are the things you're doing when you're most on, when you feel great, totally plugged in, that you tend to move away from when you're feeling stress. And then realize that, and then commit 100% fiercely, non-negotiating, I am going to do this, this, and this every single day or X times a week for the rest of my life, period. And of course you'll fall short and then you'll start again. But that commitment, that's it. I mean, that's the essence of my personal approach to life. As you know, we pay our team an hour a day to do those things. And it's the essence of actualization. And there's no way, in my opinion, that we can truly serve profoundly if we're not starting with that, with the fundamentals. And as a little side note here, I love the story of if you want to see how tall a building is going to be, look at how deeply they're digging the foundation. If you want a single-story house, great. You can have a very shallow foundation. If you want a skyscraper, if you want to do something great in your life, you need to invest in a very, very deep foundation. That's the fundamentals for me. And that's you don't do it once and done kind of thing. That's every single day we show up and get a little bit better and master these fundamentals. So, as you know, that's the essence of my work and what I see as the core of my strength and our company's strength.
Yeah, I've never heard that story before. I really like that. That makes a lot of sense. The idea of a skyscraper and looking at how deep they're digging, and it's funny that people do forget and start to cut away from those things right away, and then wonder why things just get out of control when you don't have the basic fundamentals down. That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
I was wondering, and something that when I was in the Peace Corps, I connected with a lot, that you would say a lot. You said that you wanted to use your strengths in the greatest service to the world. And when I would hear that, and I was in Mongolia with the Peace Corps and thinking about that a lot myself, I think that's a really special way to think about your own confidence, your own strength, but what it's all for. I was wondering if you could explain what that means to you when you say using your strengths in greatest service to the world.
Yeah, I appreciate you reflecting that phrase, and that's as you know, one of my favorite phrases. And when I say our purpose for our business, it's to help people optimize their lives so we can change the world together. So for me, there's always a closing of the loop. It's not a narcissistic, how great can I be? Can I get this car and that house? Nothing against those things. But if that's our primary focus, if the extrinsic drivers are our primary focus of impressing people, accumulating more wealth and having more power and more hotness, science says unequivocally, even if you're succeeding in pursuit of those things, you will be less psychologically stable than people who have an intrinsic orientation. Intrinsic orientation, as you know, is based on a desire to improve ourselves, to deepen our relationships, and to make a contribution. And so for me, that phrase captures that idea of how do I optimize my life, do the things that help me connect to something bigger than myself, not for me per se, but such that I can give myself most fully to the world. And again, to bring it back to Campbell, his idea of following your bliss wasn't so that you can go sip, pina coladas on a beach somewhere. The hero's journey was all about basically discovering yourself so you can give yourself to the world. And as he said, capturing the treasure, defeating the dragon, or whatever myth you want to take, is actually easier oftentimes than bringing it back, bringing the boon back. So once you've discovered yourself to a degree or to a really high level, the real challenge is, well, how do you give yourself? How do you reintegrate back into the world in a way that has deep meaning for you, is in integrity, is authentic, and is part of you serving profoundly? So that for me is what it captures, and that sense of what is it that I and only I can do is one of the questions that I like to ask myself. And that starts with being a great husband and being a great father. Who else is going to be a great father to my son? And I think a lot of times we get caught up in this idea of changing the world, and we forget the fact that it starts with our families, and being extraordinary partners in our relationships, and parents if we're blessed to be parents, or sons and daughters, and then it ripples out. But I think I find that to be extraordinarily important. And so much more we can talk about there, but I'll turn it back to you.
No, I love that. Well, it reminds me of so many of the quotes from Philosopher's Notes about if you want to change the world, first change your state, and if you want to do that, first change your community. And it comes all the way back to yourself first. And you keep saying it throughout all this interview. You start with yourself, then you work out from there. And when I try to explain to people this idea of an everyday humanitarian, I always bring it back to that. I say, and with Peace Corps, I know people get excited about Peace Corps, but Peace Corps taught me a lot, and one of the things it taught me the most is that everything we do matters. And it doesn't mean that you need to go across the world to make a difference across the world. You can start right here. And it sounds so cliche, but it's so true, and it's hard to make the cliche sound more true because it's so hard to explain sometimes. But I was wondering, can you jump on that, the idea of an everyday humanitarian? What does that mean to you, and what kind of advice do you give to others to pursue that?
Well, I love the phrase, and I think you just articulated it well. And I think this is part of the challenge in our culture, is that everything needs to be blingy and sexy and just, awesome and just huge. And the reality is that the path of the master, as George Leonard described, and so many great teachers, is one in which we embrace the mundane. And we realize that, what? That's all nice. And again, I have nothing against beauty and wealth and luxury and these things. I mean, who doesn't want that? But when we orient toward doing the little things as well as we possibly can, and doing it with a deep sense of commitment to excellence and arete, as you know I'm so passionate about, and it being about something bigger than ourselves, and then every single moment gives us an opportunity to practice and to serve and to be an everyday humanitarian. It's almost like a every moment humanitarian, right? Of moment to moment to moment, we have a choice, as Maslow says: step forward into growth or step back into safety. And oftentimes we think that we're waiting for this big moment. And like you said, what in the Peace Corps, if it's going around the world to serve in Mongolia or wherever, which is in itself extraordinary, of course, but this moment gives us an opportunity. Are we going to smile at the individual who's helping us check out our groceries? Or are we going to be on our iPhone, or looking at our phone and distracted and yeah. Or, we're going to open the door for the person coming in behind us at the movie theater. Every moment gives us an opportunity to bring just a little bit more kindness into the world. And then are you going to sleep in or stay up late and drink the extra beer, a glass of wine, and tool around on the internet or watch another reality TV show? You're going to go to bed so you can get up early tomorrow morning feeling great and start your meditation practice when you want to, and you're going to go out and exercise. All those things, in my mind, are absolutely part of being an everyday humanitarian. And there's no separation. As Genpo Roshi says, the temple walls are down. There's no, let me go to the monastery or to the church or to the temple for an hour, a week, or a day, or whatever it is, and that's it. Or let me go to Mongolia and that's it. It's every single moment literally gives us an opportunity to be a little bit more plugged in and a little bit more grounded in these ideas. That's what I think of and what I feel when I feel into your beautiful phrase of everyday humanitarian.
Thank you. I think that's wonderful. And as you're talking, I keep having all these reminders of other things that you've said and other things you've read. I think it was the Everyday Enlightenment book that you wrote a Philosopher's Note about that I love, and it brings the same idea that it's not enlightenment's not this end goal; it's an every moment opportunity, and we have enlightened moments, which is wonderful. But you also reminded me of Maslow, who I admire greatly, and I like that Chip talked about him. I don't know if you remember this, and it's a little fuzzy in my head, but he talked about the pyramid, the hierarchy of needs. self-actualization at the top. But Chip Connolly was talking about a second version of the pyramid that Maslow was working on, where there was service at the top too, and talking about that. Do you remember that? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I love it, and this is a big part of Maslow's work. And a lot of times people think it stops at self-actualization. The phrase he used was self-transcendence, where it's about more than you. And to me, that's an inevitable flowering. And where I think a lot of people get confused when the conversation around ego and that sort of thing, from my vantage point, and what Maslow and Western psychoanalytic people would talk about is you need to have an extraordinarily strong ego. If you look at the Western model, there's the ego, which is kind of navigating the id, which is your impulses, and your superego, which is your conditioning. Most people, when they say, oh, my ego had me do that, it wasn't their ego, it was their id. They were impulsively going after something, lustfully or whatever. Or they were shooting on themselves with social conditioning and doing what they thought they needed to do or what would be impressive, etc. So what I love about Maslow's work and others is you need to be really, really strong. You've got to have a very strong ego. And it's a strong ego that gets you to sit down and meditate rather than hop online. Your id wants to go hop online, but you need to be strong enough to know that there's something bigger than you. And then what Maslow says is when you've ascended that hierarchy and you've actually actualized your individualized potential, you transcend it. Where people get I think, a little bit confused is they try to go to transcend before they've actually included. And as Nathaniel Branden says, you can't let go of something you never had hold of. So you can't let go of an ego you actually never had control of. It's impossible. It's almost impossible to do in general. And it's particularly impossible to do for people who never had hold of it. So I love that. But then what I found in my life is that the more that I deeply engage in these practices and strive to be just a truly healthy human being, that as I do that, your heart opens naturally. And there's this transcendence and there's deep connection to something bigger than yourself. And then, as Ken Wilber says, and these are my favorite people to talk about this, you transcend yet include your ego. It's not ego minus, it's ego plus. And the greatest people who we admire the most had huge egos. They were just plugged into something bigger than themselves and very, very powerfully expressed the highest within themselves. And that's what I love and admire. And again, one more person on that, Campbell says, when he looks at East and West, how it's strange that you're basically trying to get rid of the very thing that keeps you in the game, is how he phrased it. So we want to strengthen that. And then I think and know that the inevitable outcome of that is a flowering of true transcendence and love and compassion and humanitarian service and all that good stuff. But the essence of it is the disciplined practice. Show up. Do whatever you say is important. It may or may not be meditation or nutrition or exercise, but whatever you know to be your core fundamentals, honor them. And in my vantage point, you can't help but move beyond your smaller egoic self when you do that consistently.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I picture somebody somebody could forget what they're talented at, forget what makes them so unique, and just, pretend that they don't have lots of influence or lots of money or whatever it may be, but someone else might really understand. And it reminds me of Peace Corps, where a volunteer has so many things they can bring to the table. And to know who that is and to walk into a room and be able to use that to help others instead of pretending it doesn't exist and just ignoring it, or just getting so wound up in it that you can't see past it, but take it, use it. And it reminds me of the question I wanted to ask you was someone who sees you and is so inspired by you and thinks, oh, I'd love to do what he does. I think you're already giving the advice right here of be who you are, take what you're good at and use that to help others as much as you possibly can. But I'll still ask the question anyway, how should someone get started when they see all these great things that you've done and they think, oh, I'd love to do something that great? How do they get started? How do they start moving down that path for themselves?
Yeah, well, what comes to mind is my steps, again, in hindsight. I didn't have the awareness when I did it, but it's baby steps. It's a heroic journey, honoring that, going for it, taking the next step, being willing to fail, being willing to make mistakes, and really dialing in. If I can rewind, I have no regrets whatsoever because everything I've done has brought me to this point. And the mistakes are frankly the best things because they give me compassion that I can now bring in a deeper level of sensitivity. But if I could rewind time and go back to, when I was first starting at 18, 20, 22, 24, etc., I meditate every day for 12 to 15 minutes. Science is unequivocal about that. I would cultivate my grit and my sense of virtue and a combination of intense passion and intense persistence. I'd rock my fundamentals, wouldn't miss a day of meditation. I'd exercise 3, 4, 5, 6 times a week. I'd eat really well. I'd experiment with what works for me, but eat really well. I'd get plenty of rest. I'd do the very basic things that keep me plugged in, and then I'd just let it rip and just go for it. And cultivate a level of fearlessness that it doesn't start as fearlessness. It starts as courage, which comes from the French and Latin words for heart, which basically, courage is the virtue. It's the heartbeat of your life. It's what it takes to move through your fears, to do what you're here to do. And then you get to a point where for me, I used to be super insecure, super scared of everything, right? And it's been a process for me over the last 20 years to cultivate it, where now it really is a sense of fearlessness of really, what are we nervous about? What's really going to go wrong? And then actually reorienting to that and to really realize that our potential exists on the other side of our comfort zone, which we know if we've done any of this work, but to really embrace that. And then The Rise of Superman is a great book talking about that. And another one is called The Tools. And they basically teach us to reframe the whole idea of fear, that rather than avoid it, you move right toward it. And you orient, that's your north point on your compass. And you literally move toward it. Feeling anxious, feeling nervous, feeling stressed, that's where you head. And of course, there's a certain amount of healthy fear, but to move toward that and to have a total growth mindset where you're just trying to get a little bit better. You're not perfect. You're never going to be perfect, but you want to get a little bit better every day. That's a mindset I continue to cultivate. And my gosh, if I was able to impart that sense to my old younger self and to anyone who's getting going on this journey or whatever phase, that's what excites me now, is to fully own that. And then, as you said, express yourself. Just turn off all comparison. That's one of the most toxic things we can do. Science tells us this. Comparing yourself to other people in any way is incredibly toxic. All you want to do when you think of other people is to celebrate what's awesome in them. Never think, wow, this person's done that. He's how old? And I should have done this by this age, and something's wrong with me. That's a great way to grind yourself into a hole, and throw dirt on yourself. It's not. I'm a master at that in the past. So just express yourself, and then take inspiration from, Travis's work, my work, other people who may inspire you, and then see that anything you admire in them is either expressed or latent in you. And so, I like to look at my heroes and say, wow, they're amazing. I want more of Marcus Aurelius's energy in my life. I want more of Ralph Waldo Emerson's energy in my life. I want more of Steve Jobs' energy in my life. How do I alchemize what I really admire in them and channel that through who I am in the most authentic, creative, fun, expressive way? So it's a long-winded answer to your short question.
That's a great answer. And it also reminds me, you haven't said this exactly, but I think draw yourself closer to those people. If they're still alive, obviously reach out to them, say that you love them, email them, whatever. If they're not, draw yourself closer to however you can. The videos they've created, the books. I mean, you surrounded yourself for months with these people, and you've been doing it for years. Surrounded yourself with all of these people that you admire. Then you even went as far as to say, this is my spiritual family tree. Here's this person and that person and what they mean to me. I think that's a great example that everybody can do that, and everybody has different people and real people. They're in their family and their friends to surround themselves with as well.
Yeah, exactly.
One thing I know you talked about throwing up, and that's an example of, this is not a direction to go. In the past, you've also talked about goosebumps, and that's a positive example of you're going in the right direction. But it's just kind of a fun question, I guess. What are some of the positive things that let you know that you're going in the right direction?
Yeah, the word that comes to mind is enthusiasm. So in theos, God within, you feel enthusiasm. You feel a joy for life, kind of a effervescent, wow, this is awesome. And that sense of it can be punctuated with the actual goosebumps and just that sense of, this is amazing. Like, the questions I've used to get to that point include, how can I get paid to do what I love to do? What would I pay to do? I'd literally pay to have conversations like this and to have really inspiring conversations that uplift me, uplift you, uplift people who are paying attention or tuning in. And I'd literally pay to do that. I'd pay to read books. Literally, I would pay to do that. And then how do I get paid to do that? I love what we do, entrepreneurially and creatively with our business. Literally, I love it, and it's not work for me. Some aspects of it become a little more mundane, but even that, how do I make that fun and make that something that's part of a bigger game? So I think that's huge, is just orienting to that more and more consistently. And then it's often easier, like Socrates said, his daemon, his guiding spirit, didn't necessarily tell him what was right. It just told him what was wrong. So it's easier to tune into, that's not it. And it's kind of a hell yeah or no attitude, where we're kind of, we can be paper cutted by life of all the obligations and the things that we think we should do. But when we really step back and look at it and say, what's a hell yeah in my life? What's a yes, I really feel engaged to that. And then be willing to say, I want as much of my life to be that as I possibly can. And I'm going to plant such a profoundly deep yes to these things that I can say a polite, direct no to the other things that aren't that. And having the courage and the audacity to do that is what has allowed me to really experience more of those goosebumps, enthusiastic moments. And then when you practice that, because I sucked when I first started doing that, but with anything, when you practice it and practice it and practice it, you see that percent of hell no, but I got to spend 98% of my time doing it. And the hell yes, 2%. And you just get a little bit better. That percent can literally swap. And that's been my experience. It doesn't happen overnight, but if we're willing to work, as diligently, patiently, persistently, over the long run, you're bound to be successful. It truly is that simple.
I love that. My last question for you. This has been incredible, by the way, and a really wonderful interview. I feel like we could just talk forever. My last question is how we can help you. We being all the people that are watching this and are super inspired, people that really admire you. How can we best help you?
Well, that's a beautiful question, and my immediate thought on that is, what inspires me the most is inspired people practicing the ideas that they know to be true and moving from theory to practice. So I think the only way we can ever help anyone is to actually be in integrity, to do the things that we know are important to us. And when we do that, as Campbell says, we're a light. He says we're transparent to the transcendent. Then people see us and that we're alive and that we're living this life, and we show what's possible. And that gives me tears in my eyes, like this sense of, wow, if they can do it, I can do it. And I think that's the greatest gift we can ever give anybody. And what inspires me the most is to create a community and a company that's all about that, where that's what we're doing for one another is, wow, thank you, like high five, like, yeah, way to crush it. Look what I did, and this is what we're doing. And again, that's the core. And then the details of how we may be able to intersect and support one another in a more tangible level, although that's the most in the real sense, I think tends to come to light. But that's what always inspires me the most, is to know that, it's always touching, and it's an honor to know that something that I've done has helped someone shape their life in that way. But it's always, yeah, I did this. I'm meditating. I've meditated every day for a year now. My life has completely changed. Thank you. Like those are my greatest gifts that I receive,
Yeah. Well, as you were saying that, I was picturing you and thinking about, when I had first seen you online, and it was all through blogs and things, but the more I just watched what I could find, or videos or audio, integrity was the word that just kept coming up over and over for me, that you knew who you were. You also were clear that you were learning and growing and changing, but that you were willing to share that with people and say, I'm not sure exactly how things are going to work out, but I'm gonna be kind of audacious and say what my goal is, not knowing if it's going to work, but I'll just put it out there. And I've learned that doing that always helps, is always a good decision. And it is terrifying for people. They're like, I don't want to tell people my dream because then it might not happen. Well, tell them your dream and it probably will, but share it. And the more you've shared, the more you've helped me see what I can share. And I feel like everything you just said is absolutely what you do, which is very, very inspiring to watch.
Thank you.
Well, Brian, this has been such a joy, such a pleasure to be able to sit down with you. Thank you so much for joining us. I think this is a wonderful first interview for our conference, and I hope everybody enjoys the rest of our great interviews. But thank you so much for sharing this great wisdom with us and for bringing us this in Theos community. It's such a pleasure to be able to be part of it.
Right on. Well, thank you. I'm honored to be the kickoff session here, and I'm just thrilled to be a partner with you and helping you get your wisdom out. So thanks for all you do, and look forward to seeing you soon.
Thanks, Brian.